Hi, Marilyn. This is County Council member Wanika Fisher from the Prince George's County Council. You're tuned in to the Conduit Street podcast, your inside track on county governments.
You're listening to The Briefing Room here on the Conduit Street podcast. I'm Dom Butchko. This is episode 4 of our 5-part conversation on energy. If you've held on this long, thank you. And if you're just tuning in, be sure to go back and listen to our earlier episodes where we cover many of the big subjects shaping Maryland's energy landscape. Today, we are diving headfirst into controversy because we are talking about data centers. Once held as a massive win for communities, data centers have gone from being courted by local governments to now being actively fought or outright banned. To help break down this complex topic, we have an exciting guest. Joe Lerch is Director of Local Government Policy with the Virginia Association of Counties. Virginia has been at the center of the data center boom, with Loudoun County just over the Potomac River playing home to Data Center Alley. Joe, welcome to the briefing room.
Thanks, Tom, for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
To start off, when we're talking about data centers, let's just break down what they are. What is a data center? Why do they matter? Give us the basics.
Yeah, no, I think that the basics of a data center is to think about where the world transacts, essentially where we've evolved to. You think about financial transactions, emails, streaming services. This all happens coming through data centers in a secure location. And it's become a large part of our commerce and our daily life.
It's also part of the big AI boom where you need a lot of centralized computing power, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going back on some of my notes when we did, because we have our own podcast series called The Energy Landscape of Virginia, and it was really born out of this need to inform our members about data centers and other big issues like utility scale solar. And I was going back, and it was an interview we had at Equinix, which is in Loudoun County, and first built their first data center in 1999 to provide, kind of this space where their tenants could interact. And Chris Kim, who's the executive vice president there, he talked about two types of the AI. There's kind of your inference of use of the AI. So you ask a chatbot, ChatGPT, a question, and it does that, searching its database, what it's learned to give you an answer. So that's one part of it. The other one that's more, I think, energy intensive is the language learning models, where it's doing some heavy computing to figure out how it's going to answer those inference questions. And those can be located anywhere because there's not a latency issue, but they are huge consumers of energy.
Now, physically, what does a data center actually look like? There's a lot of talk, but I'm not sure everybody realizes what the physical structure, when it's located in your community and in your neighborhood, what it actually looks like. How does it meld? How does it impact the surrounding environment? Go into that a little bit.
Probably let's go from the outside in. So from the outside in, first thing you see is kind of just a lot of steel gates, security. They're heavily secure. There's a reason for that, which is all these transactions going there, and you got to worry about security and cybersecurity. And then you'll see these buildings that are not very pretty, honestly, because they don't have a lot of windows, because their idea is not to be transacting physically there. It's really to secure that spot.
They're like big warehouses, aren't they? They're like massive.
They kind of look like, big warehouses. In fact, it's kind of a funny story. Driving up 95 from Richmond, going up into Fredericksburg into DC, this huge building went up. It was looking like this massive building, and people would ask me, Joe, I assume that's a data center. Turns out it was Kalahari Water Park. And then once they started seeing the tubes on the outside, but people are now very accustomed to say, oh, big warehouse going up, either distribution or data center. And then when you get into the physical guts, and another thing about the outside of it, you might see them sometimes on the outside of the building, but a lot of times they try to get them kind of in the internal part of the landscape or the campus is the backup generators, which are typically diesel. So you'll see those like these kind of long, almost like container sized generation things going there. On the internal, it's basically just computer racks that are presence of the internet. It's also part of the cloud where it stores a lot of the data that we access. There'll be fiber optic cables running in and out of there. Now, obviously, because of the energy demands, they need to cool those things. So you'll see a lot of cooling equipment, cooling towers on the top. They can be relatively noisy on the inside when you're going through, looking at the cages and walking through. They can be a little bit cold too if you're not ready for it, but they try to balance that working environment for the people that need to be in there.
Talk a little bit about the diesel backup generation, because I know here in Maryland, not so much this year, but like last year in 2025, that backup generation and energy and how we cite these things, that became a pretty controversial issue. Have you seen something similar in Virginia?
There's been concerns, particularly from people that are located near the data centers. Now, so for a little bit, that backup generation is there for a reason. It's should the grid go down, this would be a way to keep the internet running in that case. And so they need that there for that kind of redundancy. What's interesting about that, though, is that you need to test these periodically. And in the testing of them, there's concerns about maybe particulate emissions coming from them.
Right. That was the big thing here, the testing.
Yeah. The question is, should these be permitted differently than your typical power plant because they only run intermittently or only really meant to run intermittently for testing? And then maybe if there's a power outage. So there's been some concerns about how they're permitted. I do know that if you get into the weeds about the type of backup diesel generation, there's what's known now as a tier 4 backup diesel generator, which seems to be the best in terms of air quality. So that's one of the things that people are looking at. I know there's conversations about going to batteries, lithium-ion type batteries or other type battery storage. The problem there is how do you get that long duration storage so that it's available? Because your typical lithium-ion batteries, it can only run for about 4 hours. What if you need more than that?
I want to zoom in on why Virginia is the center of this, because Virginia, second best Commonwealth in the country. Probably third best state after Pennsylvania and Maryland. But why is everything headquartered in Loudoun? What is the secret sauce that you guys have that other folks don't?
Yeah, essentially, I was going back over my notes and was talking to Julie Briskman, who's the vice chair of the Loudoun County Board, and also Chris Kim. It was just kind of a confluence of circumstance. So you got to go back to the 1990s, and I know you're not old enough to remember AOL, which is America Online, but they were located in Loudoun, kind of providing that first, you've got mail, email, and because of AOL's presence there, because of the fiber optic that was being brought out there, it was the perfect spot for some of these startup companies like Equinix, who built its first, data center there, to provide a place for internet service providers with the fiber optic connection to connect to one another. And it really started out just kind of the email space. Then it switched to, well, now we need to run our internet through here, financial transactions, that latency aspect, being so close, to the financial centers of the Eastern Seaboard. So it kind of related to that. And I think as a part of that was Loudoun County's reaction to that, because if you go back to that time, there was a bit of a housing crash at that time. And
which is the total opposite of what we're living through right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they had a glut of housing. This was in the early to mid 90s. What they found out is they were heavily reliant on their homes and the real estate associated with that for the revenue. It was like 80% of their revenue base. And they only had 19% from commercial. And so they said, how do we switch this? And they had a goal, I think, of getting up to 29% of their real estate or their revenue being from a commercial base. And Buddy Reiser, who was hired as their economic development director, and he's still there today and been heavily involved in courting the data center industry. That was part of that, bringing them to Virginia, bringing them to Loudoun. And today they're at about 49% of their revenue coming from commercial, a large part of that being from data centers. So that's kind of the background of why Loudoun.
For Loudoun County, like zooming in on them, that's quite the shift in economics, where 80% from residential, now it's almost 50% from commercial. It sounds like a big chunk of that coming from data centers. That's really smart planning on their end.
Yeah, it's really interesting about it too, is that you have to kind of plan for it, because to give you one example of how important that revenue source is to them is during COVID, when there was a disruption in supply chains and you weren't getting what you needed for the GPUs to refresh some of the equipment. And to give you an idea of how the revenues collected is when you have fresh new GPUs, those general processing units, you start to assess the value of the tax on that. It depreciates over time. And then it gets replaced after 3 to 5 years, and then you get that revenue again. Well, it wasn't being replaced. And all of a sudden they had, I think, about $100 million hole in their budget, operating budget that they weren't prepared for. Moving forward, they said, let's set aside a reserve fund, knowing that there might be disruptions and change. But that gives you an idea of how important that revenue source is, how they operate. It allowed them to reduce the real estate tax to make it a little more affordable to live in Loudoun. Still very expensive, I know, within that Northern Virginia market and DC market.
Are they seeing the opposite now? And maybe you didn't do a deep dive on Loudoun's budget, and that's okay. But with everyone, focusing on chips now and focusing on building out AI, I would imagine they're in the opposite spot where more revenue is coming in now.
Yeah, I think their revenue has been increasing. It's pretty steady. They're at a point now where they're really reaching max capacity for any new data centers. We may touch on this a little later, the impact to the electric infrastructure there, particularly transmission lines.
We'll be touching on that for sure. Yeah. So good little flag.
Yeah. But, as long as they keep operating in Loudoun, they keep refreshing this equipment and it gets more compact. One of the things that I heard, they built a shell building for a data center and all of a sudden they needed less space because the equipment was getting smaller and smaller, but then they could fit in more data centers or more of the racks for other internet presence there from different companies.
Oh, that's an interesting way to think about the data center debate. If we are increasing efficiency and chip efficiency, how much are we still going to need to expand? And this whole question, and when we talked about the resource drain, we'll get to that. But is that going to be a thing 10 years from now, or are we just going to efficiency our way out of it?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Like how much smaller they can get. And quantum, I don't know anything about quantum computing. It kind of just boggles me that you could do a quantum computer. Maybe would that make them smaller? Maybe their energy would be less. Who knows? I think that's a big question mark moving forward.
Speaking of question marks, and we're talking about revenue, when a data center comes to town, it comes to town with a lot of promises. Sometimes they talk about jobs. Most of those are short term. The revenue could be a really big thing that local jurisdictions want to bring in. But then there is concerns about energy. A big one I've also been hearing about is concerns about water consumption and how we're managing that. Talk about first, what are the promises that you guys have been made or you've heard about versus when these do come to your community, what's actually the deliverables?
Yeah, so, a good place to start is a couple years ago, the Virginia General Assembly and their legislative, accounting watchdog agency called the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission did a deep dive into data centers. And if you want, we could probably provide a link in the show notes to that report because it's really informative. But what they found was there definitely was the revenue on the taxation on not only on the processing equipment, but also all the heating and cooling equipment. And a little side note to that, Virginia provides a very lucrative incentive to the data center industry. And it's 100% sales and use tax exemption on that purchase of that equipment, not only the processing equipment, but the heating and cooling equipment. And to the tune right now, in a most recent report from the Department of Tax and Virginia Economic Development partnership, it's about a $2 million tax incentive in Virginia now on an annual basis. And so that was a real incentive. So the state is providing that incentive. They do get some of that revenue back through increase in employment. You'll have maybe less employment than you would in actual manufacturing when the data center's up and running. It just depends on the type of data center. If it's a leasing operation, they might have a lot of people coming in and out of there for their equipment. But where we've seen a huge, big increase in employment is in the construction industry, particularly contractors, things of that nature. A lot of times when there's debates here in Richmond involving data centers, you will see the local electric unions get involved and being very pro data center because of how important it's been for their industry in Virginia. I want to say that the majority of the economic benefit that the state and the locals are getting is actually from the construction industry. And one of the things that I delve into in a podcast, I talked to the main author of that Joe Lerch Center study, and we talked about at a point where Virginia stops building data centers, there will be a kind of loss in that income and revenue from that, all that construction industry. So that's kind of on, I think on the positive side. Obviously, I touched a little bit on this, like how do they fit into a community? They don't look very pretty. So how do you fit them within in a community? Loudon's learned a lot along the way about maybe doing more aesthetics and kind of the outside architecture of how they fit in. There are concerns about noise that have been raised and legitimate concerns, in Loudon and Prince William and in other areas where it's this constant hum. And if you think about it, I come from back around being a local planner and local zoning official, and you have these noise ordinances, and they were usually related to events, football game, a party. This is just a constant hum at a certain decibel level, and that has some impacts on communities. And a lot of our members are trying to figure out, how do you dampen that noise? How do you work on distances? How do you really address those? You touched a little bit about water consumption. The one thing about the data center report from Joe Lerch, they didn't find that to be a big issue, particularly in Virginia up to this point. Loudoun County actually provides a certain amount of reclaimed water from their sewage treatment plant to help cool the data centers. I do know that the data centers are getting more efficient in how they cool, and they might switch to a different type of operation system that might be more air cooling. Of course, that increases your energy demand. Probably the bigger impact we've seen within the communities in the state as a whole is the amount of energy that's needed to run these. It's in the hundreds of megawatts up to gigawatts of power, a constant source. And where that puts a strain is not only in where you get the energy from in the grid, whether it's within the state of Virginia or within the larger PJM grid, but it also, you need that infrastructure. You need those transmission lines. You need those substations to serve that. And there's right now a proposal for a 765 kV line going from, I think, around Campbell County, Lynchburg, going up into Northern Virginia. And it's the biggest size line that Dominion Energy has ever built. And a large part of that is to serve all of this need, largely from data centers. And so there's concerns about these huge lines cutting across swaths of Virginia. And some of our members are raising concerns and oppositions to those coming through. Is all of that data centers? No, it's not. I mean, there's a lot of other demands coming through, but a large part of that is being driven by that. I think the other part that people are very concerned about is the source of power. Is it coming from fossil fuel plants? I remember reading an article just over a year ago in the Washington Post where there were coal plants in West Virginia that were slated to be decommissioned, no longer needed, but they're asked to stay on by PJM because of that power demand, largely coming from data centers in Northern Virginia and in the DC region.
I want to go back really quick on that point on water you brought up. That's really interesting that you guys found that as of right now, that's not a really big deal, because here on the other side of Potomac in Frederick County, they're trying to do a little mini data center alley. There's some local controversy there as the word about data centers goes out. Communities are getting really upset. But one of the big things, talking with like their folks on the ground actually implementing this, a barrier to new data centers is how Maryland permits water and how much data centers use water for cooling and how those systems work. And a barrier that's set up right now for more data centers coming to Maryland is if we're either taking from the Potomac or taking from an aquifer and we're not recycling that water. And it sounds like currently there's no administrative or physical framework or infrastructure to do that, then that limits how many we can come here. So I find it interesting that Virginia doesn't have that same problem.
Yeah, it is interesting. Now, I will say this. If you get to the eastern part of the state, more of the coastal plain, that is an area that's much more managed by the state in terms of water supply, permitting, and planning of our eastern groundwater management area. And there's, I think, a valid concern there about data centers going in and putting a straw on the ground and, taking that out. To the point where Hampton Roads Sanitation District Commission now has a project where they're actually taking treated wastewater and pumping it back into the aquifer and measuring how that's affecting the aquifer. It's a really fascinating project. We can provide a link to that.
We should do a whole separate episode on that, actually, because we're looking at similar stuff here. And that's like, we can go down a deep rabbit hole with recharging aquifers with clean water.
But I think, and I will, with the caveat that I think the Joe Lerch report noticed it's not a problem yet, but it could become a problem. And of course, they're not the only ones demanding water use. There could be other types of, users, manufacturers. To give you an example, medical marijuana cultivation, those are big users of water and even electricity, because people think of, well, oh, it's agriculture. Well, it's agriculture under lights in a lot of these big warehouses.
Yeah, but Joe, who doesn't love a gummy every now and then? That's different.
It's demand of another sort.
So we talked about this. We actually got really deep into it, some of the externalities here. So energy, water. I will say on transmission, at least you're building a transmission line across your state to help your state. I have to rib you a little bit for the Piedmont project that's going from Pennsylvania through Maryland down to Virginia into Loudoun. That's causing a lot of controversy here. So thank you for that, Joe. This is why you're the second best Commonwealth.
The Piedmont Reliability Project. Yes. Well,
yeah.
And I think the concerns you're hearing from people along that route are now being echoed by this large line. It's called, I forget the name of the Joshua Falls line is what it's called. And if you look that up on
it sounds massive. It sounds absolute, because Virginia is not a small state.
Yeah. I mean, to date, the biggest line, kV line, kilovolt line that Dominion does is a 500 line. And this 765 line, I don't know, I don't understand the math, but apparently it carries like 2 to 3 times more the voltage of a 500 kV line. And that's kind of why it's being proposed.
Zooming in on the community level for a second and like talking about Loudoun and lessons learned, what do they do on the visual side? Let's look at solar for a minute. So when we talk about solar, there was a requirement. I actually think we're no longer allowed to do it based on legislation from 2025, the Renewable Energy Certainty Act, but we used to require berms. And now we require a lot of forestation around the project. So to make sure there's trees tall enough. What can a data center do? Is it, we're going to put different color paint, or we're going to put a facade on, we're going to focus on berming? What are the types of things that you can do to make sure that these fit better into a community, at least visually?
I think, the first thing is like a setback, like how close to, say, residential or commercial. And part of that has to do with the noise impacts that you're concerned about. Obviously, planting of various types, trees that can make it look a little better than just looking at, a bunch of steel gates. Fenestration, like a little more windows on some of these. Maybe they don't look out, or maybe, it's got the dark glass on it. Those are some things that you can do. Masking the cooling equipment on top of the buildings. Making sure, I talked about, the backup diesel generators, making sure that they're kind of internal to the campus. And so you don't see these. I know in more rural areas, particularly Mecklenburg County along the North Carolina border, where Microsoft has built a bunch of data centers, you'll find those on the outside of it. And these are in largely rural areas where you would see that type of building in certain areas, whether it was an agricultural integrated operation or something of that nature. I think those are kind of the basic ways. And then, planning for within certain communities. Part of what Loudoun had to deal with, and this is a huge lesson learned, and is back in the 90s when they were recording data centers, they really thought of these as just a commercial use. And so it was a by right use in a commercial zone. What they didn't understand was how massive they would become and how they would look. And so that was part of what they learned is like, man, it's not really fit that commercial purpose, like an office purpose. And so they had to kind of rework their zoning and land use ordinances and how do you make them fit in better.
That is actually a perfect transition to my next question. I want to talk about the interplay in Virginia versus Maryland on, state versus local policy and who has what authority. Data centers, at least in Maryland, are really interesting because counties, local governments have broad land use authority, except when it comes to energy generation. Energy generation, we are preempted by the state, but everything else we're pretty flexible. For data centers, though, they create a weird policy question because they're large consumers of energy. And if they're required to generate their own power, then where does that preemption kind of fall? Or do we still have that broad authority? Is it preempted on that one part? Talk about how Virginia's handling that.
Right now, counties, localities, cities, towns, they have broad authority on regulating data centers as a land use. We still have broad authority on regulating energy generation, whatever that might be, as a land use within localities. So like in Maryland, But we do have that. One thing we don't have authority on, and I assume it's the same in Maryland, is the location and extent of transmission lines. So that we're very similar. One of the things that I think our members are struggling with is starting to understand if they approve one data center or multiple data centers, how does that impact the grid within their jurisdiction or surrounding jurisdictions because of the power infrastructure having to come through.
Looking ahead now, so last question, looking ahead, where do you see the future of data centers going for our region? So we're doing a whole thing on energy. Virginia, Maryland, we're part of the PJM and a broader Mid-Atlantic region. AI is growing. This is the hot thing right now. It seems like AI is going to be here to stay for at least the medium to long term, and we're going to need be more technologically sound and growing. What do you see as the future of data centers moving forward?
Well, I can speak right now to a big debate happening in Virginia about that. And I don't know how that'll reverberate across the PJM grid, but I can have some thoughts on that or some guesses. So I mentioned that sales and use tax exemption a little bit earlier. We actually just finished with our legislative session, got through veto session, and the one thing we did not adopt was a budget bill for the upcoming biennium. And the reason for that is that our Senate and our House are at odds over this question of that data center sales and use tax exemption. The Senate and its leadership wants to basically cancel that effective, I think, July 1st, 2027, or even sooner than that, because it was set to expire in 2035. In fact, we were having debates last year about whether that should be extended, because that has the data center industry saying, hey, look, if you extend it, we'll plan to do more data centers or refresh those equipment. Virginia will benefit from that. The House has rejected that proposal. And so we're at this crossroads. Over $1 billion worth of revenue at stake here that the Senate says we have because we're ending the tax exemption early, and the House does not. And they gaveled into a special session to address that in the budget yesterday. There was no agreement. So we don't know how that's going to map out going forward. But should Virginia change that exemption to some degree, that may affect where data centers may want to locate. Maybe they'll go to West Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland. I don't know exactly what the other tax situation incentives are in other states. Long term, I think the big question is there enough power within the PJM grid and the transmission and reliability for this? There's concerns. The wholesale market and the auctions, those cost per megawatt keep going up and up because of all this demand. I mean, PJM, you look at it geographically across the United States, it doesn't look like the largest, regional transmission organization, but I think it's the largest in terms of population. There's a lot of demands for power. And is there going to be a point where the grid gets strained and, say, during a summer peak or a winter peak, which happens a lot in Virginia, are these data centers that are going to have to go to their backup power? I think those are some of the questions that we're trying to figure out.
Well, that seems like a great place to leave it. All eyes on Richmond now for the next two months. So, Joe, thank you very much for coming on the briefing room.
I appreciate it, Dom. Looking forward to checking out the first 3 episodes that I missed.
Let me read us out. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. The Conduit Street podcast, The Briefing Room, will be out on Tuesdays with our normal show on Fridays. Remember now to register for our annual Mako Summer Conference, August 12th through the 15th in Ocean City, Maryland. And thank you to everyone for listening to The Briefing Room here on the Conduit Street podcast.